The next step is to talk about the reform process table. And this is something that doesn't look into the actual organizational effectiveness of the PPD, and it does not look about the results of the dialogue process in terms of better investments, better job, reduction of mortality, increase of the yield per hectare in the case of agricultural partnership. It doesn't look at those impacts. It looks at something much softer, which is in the institutional context, in this trust relationship or mistrust you have between the public and the private sector in that particular environment, has the dialogue process brought upon some kind of an improvement into the possibility to make reform happen. And we call this the PPD Reform Process Table. It was something that we came up with in 2006, and then it was refined by Uriel Levy in 2007, I think, in the context of an evaluation in the Mekong region. So this it's an interesting process. It's not that widely used because it's hard to do, but we want to give you a shot at doing it because we believe that it gets to the roots of what the dialogue process is all about. It's about changing the mentality, giving opportunities to people to participate, and this measures that. So what do we measure with it? What we take is we look at particular reforms. A reform that took place in the past year, in the past 2 years, where the dialogue platform was involved, or when the dialogue platform was not involved. We take those reforms and we divide them into some kind of a reform process in 5 areas, from the identification of the issue and prioritization of those, to designing of a solution, to the advocacy and handover to the public sector, to the legislative and executive process, and to the implementation, M&E and Follow-up. So we basically divide the history of a reform in 5 steps. And of course, you could divide that in different steps for if you're not working on reform, but on actions, and they are slightly different kind of steps. Feel free to do this. You can use the same kind of methodology. So you have those 5 steps. But then for each of the steps, we're going to ask basic questions, and we're going to say, what was the role of the dialogue platform in fulfilling that step for that particular policy proposal or particular action? We're going to put a 0 if the PPD had no impact on the step. We're going to put a 3 if the PPD was solely responsible for these steps, and we're going to put a 1 or a 2 for intermediary ratings. So that's the basic of how this table works. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to divide that in 2 more categories, and that's where it becomes complicated. So on the top, you have the 5 steps of the reform process, but on the left, you have 3 rows for the private sector and 3 rows for the public sector. What we're saying is we're saying, for that particular step, what was the capacity of the private sector to engage? What was their confidence? And did they have access to the public sector to engage? And for the public sector, we're going to ask, what were the government capacity to engage? What were their willingness to do so? And did they have the opportunity to consult with the private sector? And we ask particular questions for each of those, and that's the matrix you see here. And then what we do is that for each of those boxes in that matrix, we're going to put for one particular reform a 0, a 1, a 2, or a 3. And we're going to say, because of that public-private dialogue platform, now the private sector has more confidence to share, or now there is a channel that exists that did not exist before. So if you do this exercise over time, you might see a difference in those ratings, and you might see a difference in the fabric of the relationship between the public and the private sector. This is what Reform Process Table looks like in the context of Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. In the context of Cambodia, for instance, 6 reforms that were taken. So these are actually particular reform and their history behind them. And for each of the steps, in this case, there were we had 13 steps of the reform process, so it was a very fine evaluation. And you can see that eventually you get some rating, and we give a color to those ratings in a way that what we do is when the reform process was very strongly impacted by the public-private dialogue, it's a red color, otherwise it's an orange color, a yellow, or a white. Now, let me, before I show you this slide, let me go back to the Excel spreadsheet, because in the Excel spreadsheet that I talked about, the evaluation wheel, if you look at the bottom of my screen, you'll see a different tab, and that tab is the reform process table. So if you click on it, you're going to see the reform process table. That is the reform process table, and you see on the top the ratings. The 0, the 1, the 2, and the 3. The 0, the PPD has no impact on this step. The 1, this step benefited from input from this PPD. The 2, the role of the PPD was crucial in the acceleration of this step. And 3, the PPD was solely responsible for this step. What you're going to do here is you're going to have at the bottom the big matrix we talked about. Private sector capacity, private sector confidence, private sector access, government capacity, government willingness, government opportunity. And on top, the 5 reform process. I can try to do a little bit bigger. Hopefully you can see that on the screen. Diagnostic, solution design, advocacy handover, legislative executive process, and implementation and M&E. And for each of those, questions. So now you go down a little bit, and you see you take reform 1. So if on reform 1, let's say you say it was custom reform, I'm going to type custom reform. Now if I look up, you see right here it's written automatically custom reform. So that's what we're going to measure. I go down and I see for the custom reform, I see the 6 categories of things I have to answer for each of the steps. For this particular custom reform, which already took place, I'm going to do a backward analysis, historical analysis, and based on interview, based on documentation, I'm going to give a score to all these things, 0, 1, 2, or 3. So here, I'm going to give information, I'm going to put random numbers between 0 and 3. So I'm going to say that he did not have a lot of role here. Not even watching what I'm doing here, so I'm just... So I did this reform. What I did for this reform, I filled up all the information, and now I got for each box, I got a number, and now for each steps of the reform process, I've got a score. I can see that for the diagnostic part, it was 1.5. For the advocacy part, 0.6, 0.5 for the legislative, and 1.8 for the end. If I go to the top, I'm going to see that my custom reform has been automatically filled up with colors and with the numbers. If I do this for all the reform, I will have a score at the end. And the score will be, in that case here, it's 1.2. So between 0 and 3, this particular PPD, based on one reform, but you could imagine that I do the scoring for more, this particular public-private dialogue has a score of 1.2 in terms of influence on the reform process. Now, if I were to do the same exercise in the next year, and the year after that, and the year after that, over 3 or 4 years, I could see if the public-private dialogue has a stronger influence on the reform process, and if things have changed or not. And if things have changed significantly, which means that there is a point of difference, and we take that as a benchmark, 1 point difference between the score of 1 year versus another year, then you could use 0.5 if you want to, you can get a sense that the dialogue process has had a strong impact on the reform process, the political fabric of the country, and the relationship between the public and the private sector. So it's not an easy tool to use, and it requires a lot of analysis, but it's very interesting if you want to make the subjective case to say, look, this has had an impact, and we believe that it's, of course, based on subjective information, on analysis, but it gives it somewhat of a scientific basis to be able to compare the trust building, the capacity for people to engage, the willingness for people to engage, the confidence they have in engaging in a public-private dialogue process. So if I go back to the PowerPoint, I will see here in the context of Liberia, this analysis on one particular reform and the different ratings given to different points. Here, in Liberia, the administrative process law or the investment law, administrative processes that were changed or investment law are two particular things that were looked at. And you can see that this is the result of the analysis. Eventually, you had, when you look at this, what's interesting is you can see this was quite effective, not really effective on the implementation and follow-up, quite effective in terms of the advocacy handover to the public sector. And that's where it's strongest. So you can do a lot of analysis from a table like this to look at where you want to put more emphasis or where you kind of create a heat map in a way. So I'd like you to do an exercise, which is to take this the same file that you downloaded earlier and try to do a self-assessment of some reforms that you know in a country where you are and that you've been involved with, or where the dialogue process have been involved with. Of course, the reform process table is great to do a benchmark, because you can use at the beginning to have some kind of data early on and see and benchmark the progress against that. So it's very good for baseline data as well. Now I want to go to a third tool, which is a PPD scorecard. PPD scorecard is very simple. It's to measure to measure the performance of the outputs of the PPD. You look at the outputs on a specific period of time, like every 6 months, and you do that, of course, from the beginning of the PPD. And you can look at the number of working group meetings that were held, the number of plenary meetings that were held, the number of reforms proposed in all of the working groups, the number of reforms recommended for enactment by the governments, and the number of reforms that were enacted, and the number of reforms implemented. So that gives you, for the current 6 months, some kind of an idea of the effectiveness of the PPD in terms of producing reform proposals and having those reform proposals adopted. Now, of course, you should not look into the volume, you need to look in the percentages, because the question is not how much proposals are recommended, it's how much proposals are actually enacted by the stakeholders when they were proposed earlier. So it could be just one reform proposed and one reform enacted, and that gives you 100%, and that's very fine for that particular dialogue process who wanted to do just one thing. So you look into the kind of advocacy ratio and the performance of advocacy. And in a previous presentation that is on this video channel, you will find when I talk about lessons learned and knowledge gained from public-private dialogue and good practices, I explain a case about Nepal and the different kind of working groups and how you can actually balance working groups in one public-private dialogue against each other based on their advocacy ratio and the success ratio of advocacy by looking at the number of reform proposed to the number of reform enacted.